Chapter 4, Part 4. He imposes his own contours on the vanquished, who internalize this shape and become ambiguous beings housing another. From the first, the act of conquest, which reduces persons to the status of things, is necrophilic. Just as anti-dialogical action is a concomitant of the real concrete situation of oppression, dialogical action is indispensable to the revolutionary supersedence of that situation. An individual is not anti-dialogical or dialogical in the abstract, but in the world. He or she is not first anti-dialogical, then oppressor, but both simultaneously. Within an objective situation of oppression, anti-dialogue is necessary to the oppressor as a means of further oppression, not only economic, but cultural. The vanquished are dispossessed of their word, their expressiveness, their culture. Further, once a situation of oppression has been initiated, anti-dialogue becomes indispensable to its preservation. Because liberating action is dialogical in nature, dialogue cannot be a posteriori of that action, to that action, but must be a concomitant with it. And since liberation must be a permanent condition, dialogue becomes a continuing aspect of liberating action. The desire for conquest, or rather the necessity of conquest, is at all times present in anti-dialogical action. To this end, the oppressors attempt to destroy in the oppressed their quality as considerers of the world. Since the oppressors cannot totally achieve this destruction, they must mythicize the world. In order to present for the consideration of the oppressed and subjugated a world of deceit designed to increase their alienation and passivity, the oppressors develop a series of methods precluding any presentation of the world as a problem and showing it rather as a fixed entity, as something given, something to which people as mere spectators must adapt. It is necessary for the oppressors to approach the people in order via subjugation to keep them passive. This approximation, however, does not involve being with the people or require true communication. It is accomplished by the oppressors depositing myths indispensable to the preservation of the status quo. For example, the myth that the oppressive order is a free society, the myth that all persons are free to work where they wish, that if they don't like their boss, they can leave him and look for another job, the myth that this order respects human rights and is therefore worthy of esteem, the myth that anyone who is industrious can become an entrepreneur. Worse yet, the myth that the street vendor is as much an entrepreneur as the owner of a large factory. The myth of the universal right of education, when all of the Brazilian children who enter primary schools, only a tiny fraction ever reach the university. The myth of the equality of all individuals, when the question, "Do you know who you're talking to?" is still current among us. The myth of the heroism of the oppressor classes as defenders of Western Christian civilization against materialist barbarism. The myth of the charity and generosity of the elites, when what they really do as a class is to foster selective good deeds, subsequently elaborated into the myth of disinterested aid, which on the international level was severely criticized by Pope John XXIII. The myth that the dominant elites, recognizing their duties, promote the advancement of the people so that the people, in a gesture of gratitude, should accept the words of the elites and be conformed to them. The myth that rebellion is a sin against God. The myth of private property as fundamental to personal human development, so long as oppressors are the only true human beings. The myth of the industriousness of the oppressors and the laziness and dishonesty of the oppressed, as well as the myth of the natural inferiority of the latter and the superiority of the former. All these myths, and others the reader could list, the internalization of which is essential to the subjugation of the oppressed, are presented to them by well-organized propaganda and slogans via the mass communications media, as if such alienation constituted real communication. In sum, there is no oppressive reality which is not at the same time necessarily anti-dialogical, just as there is no anti-dialogue in which the oppressors do not untiringly dedicate themselves to the constant conquest of the oppressed. In ancient Rome, the dominant elites spoke of the need to give bread and circus to the people in order to soften them up and to secure their own tranquility. The dominant elites of today, like those of any epoch, continue, in a version of original sin, to need to conquer others, with or without bread and circus. The content and methods of conquest vary historically. What does not vary, as long as dominant elites exist, is the necrophilic passion to oppress. Divide and rule. This is another fundamental dimension of the theory of oppressive action, which is as old as oppression itself. As the oppressor minority subordinates and dominates the majority, it must divide it and keep it divided in order to remain in power. The minority cannot permit itself the luxury of tolerating the unification of the people, which would undoubtedly signify a serious threat to their own hegemony. Accordingly, the oppressors halt by any method, including violence, any action which in even incipient fashion could awaken the oppressed to the need for unity. Concepts such as unity, organization, and struggle are immediately labeled as dangerous. In fact, of course, these concepts are dangerous to the oppressors, for their realization is necessary to actions of liberation. It is in the interest of the oppressor to weaken the oppressed still further, to isolate them, to create and deepen rifts among them. This is done by varied means, from the repressive methods of the government bureaucracy to the forms of cultural action with which they manipulate the people by giving them the impression that they are being helped. One of the characteristics of oppressive cultural action, which is almost never perceived by the dedicated but naive professionals who are involved, is the emphasis on a focalized view of problems rather than on seeing them as dimensions of a totality. In community development projects, the more a region or area is broken down into local communities, without the study of these communities both as totalities in themselves and as parts of another totality, the area, region, and so forth, which in its turn is part of a still larger totality, the nation as part of the continental totality, the more alienation is intensified, and the more alienated people are, the easier it is to divide them and keep them divided. These focalized forms of action, by intensifying the focalized way of life of the oppressed, especially in rural areas, hamper the oppressed from perceiving reality critically and keep them isolated from the problems of oppressed women and men in other areas. The same divisive effect occurs in connection with the so-called leadership training courses, which are, although carried out without any such intention by many of their organizers, in the last analysis alienating. These courses are based on the naive assumption that one can promote the community by training its leaders, as if it were the parts that promote the whole, and not the whole which, in being promoted, promotes the parts. Those members of the communities who show sufficient leadership capacities to be chosen for these courses necessarily reflect and express the aspirations of the individuals of their community. They are in harmony with the way of living and thinking about reality which characterizes their comrades, even though they reveal special abilities which give them the status of leaders. As soon as they complete the course and return to the community with resources they did not formerly possess, they either use these resources to control the submerged and dominated consciousness of their comrades, or they become strangers in their own communities, and their former leadership position is thus threatened. In order not to lose their leadership status, they will probably tend to continue manipulating the community, but in a more efficient manner. When cultural action as a totalized and totalizing process approaches an entire community and not merely its leaders, the opposite process occurs. Either the former leaders grow along with everyone else, or they are replaced by new leaders who emerge as a result of the new social consciousness of the community. End of chapter 4, part 4.